Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
We've been talking about use, Alexander's phrase, use of the self, what he meant by the term use. Is there a definition of use? How do we use the definition of use? And what's the difference between the initial Alexander technique approach and definition of use and the modern Alexander techniques approach to this term, this phrase, this word use?
Yes, it's it's a central question because if we use a concept, you must understand that we are not discussing an everyday idea. We are not discussing a simple construction, a simple meaning for a word, because we are discussing a technique. It's obvious that there is a real action of the mind that is necessary to understand what Alexander meant by the use of the self. So coming back to the last session, that's the previous chapter interview that we had together. I explained that Alexander had found two significant facts. And he had found these facts, of course, because he had conducted investigations. So what are these two facts? First, he had found that he was responsible for certain localized defects in his reaction at a given point. In the use of the self, I think it's page 11, he said, the cause of my throat trouble was to be found in something I was doing myself when I use my voice. So that's an important fact. His throat trouble was not a congenital failure of his system. It was the result of something he was doing himself when using his voice. So that's the first fact, very important. So he had the responsibility for the defect was in what he was doing with himself. We'll have to define what do we mean by doing with doing myself. What am I doing myself, you see? Well, the second fact that he found out of his investigation, that is, I think, more relevant to the question of the meaning of the concept of use in the initial Alexander technique, is that these defects in his reaction to vocalization were not primarily due to improper use of the parts, of the mechanisms that, as he said, seemingly most immediately concern. By that he means that the defects were not due to a wrong use of the neck, wrong use of the head, or wrong use of the vocal mechanisms that are obviously involved in vocalization. But he said, but these defects were the indirect results of defects in his general use of himself, and in particular, defects in his manner of using the whole torso. So I am not inventing anything here, as you will see. I'm showing on screen a passage, just a sentence. And that sentence comes from the book that is most well known of Alexander, his third book, 1932. It's The Use of the Self. And what he says here is that this new piece of evidence, well, he found through his experiments, suggested that the functioning of the organs of speech was influenced by his manner of using the whole torso, and that the pulling of the head back and down was not, as he had presumed, merely a misuse of the specific parts concerned, but one misuse that was inseparably connected, inseparably bound up with a misuse of other mechanisms which involve the act of shortening the stature. So Alexander had voice difficulty, voice problem. He had an inflammation of the uvula and the part of the larynx, and that led to having loss of voice. Yeah. And so he experimented and he found that, of course, he was, while vocalizing, increasing a visible defect in his mirrors. He was pulling the head and neck back, or the head back, if you want. But it's not the head back, the movement of the head relatively to the neck, that was the cause of the throat trouble. He found it was his manner of using the whole torso. So on this picture of the sentence that is presented at the moment, I have added a picture that Alexander used in the fourth book, in the Universal Constant in Living, in the third chapter. You know, on my edition is page 66. On this is showing what is a definite wrong general use. So it's quite important to have this picture and place this picture next to the sentence, because very often we forget the obvious. Here, Alexander could predict voice problem for this individual. It's the Sergeant Major picture. It's aligning the self on the plumb line. So the plumb line is going through the ear spot. It's the top part of the spine going in between the ears, and then it's going right down onto the ankle. And we see that, of course, there is a serious series of specific problems that Alexander takes trouble of describing every single time. The arms are set or wear behind the rib cage. We have the lower rib cage that is protruding. That is, the lower rib cage is forward of the front of the ankle. The lower rib cage is forward of the face. So we cannot say that the head is forward in this picture. On this picture, what is forward is the abdomen, the protruding abdomen. And this leads to a geometrical consequence, which is that if you look at the back of the torso, you will see that the lumbar spine is really short. And that is, if you take two extremities and, well, of course, the center, you will find that the center is not aligned with the two extremities. The center is very far forward. You could have the same conclusion of shortening of the spine if the center of the curve was also, and that is possible, very far backward. There will be a shortening of the spine in both situations, according to Alexander, because he describes the shortening of the spine as a geometrical condition of the back. He says that the pulling of the neck and head back is not a specific action that is separated from other action. So if while vocalizing is in fact showing these geometrical relations, it's not a problem that can be attributed to, of course, the neck and head. The pulling of the head back and down is the result not of one isolated movement of the head relatively to the neck, but this incorrect combination of the movement of the neck and head occurs indirectly, as it is subordinated to the combined movements of all the parts of the anatomical structure that the subject has the habit of performing in all his activities, and particularly in his act of vocalization. The manner of using the whole torso, as you can see here, it's an extreme situation. There are others. I'm showing another picture where I am using on the left two different wrong general use of the self. And these two are coming from Alexander's book. The first one on the left, as I say, comes from the last book, but the one on the center, the one that is on the right here, where you see a man without head, this picture comes from the first book. So regarding the wrong use of the self, it's tempting to think that Alexander has not changed his mind about the general use of the self. Remember that the Sergeant Major on the left is from the 1932. It's the last book, while the gentleman lifting his arm, and as a result of lifting the arm, this gentleman is also presenting a form of general misuse, yes? So we are not discussing for Alexander, when we are discussing use, the pulling of the head back and down is not the result of an isolated movement of the head relatively to the neck. It's subordinated with combined movement of all the parts of the anatomical structure, and particularly the torso. The manner of using the whole torso conditioned the use of the neck and head. It conditioned the use of the lips, the use of the tongue, the use of the larynx, the use of the lungs. That is every movement necessary for vocalization. Remember that Alexander started his exploration because of throat trouble that he found out because he was overusing, as is often said, his voice mechanism. So the vocalization act and the Alexander technique are combined at the start. You must understand that it's because Alexander was using his voice that he started to be interested in the general use of the text, the self. So on the right, you see Alexander teaching his technique to a young girl. Yeah. So it's quite interesting to see how what is the relative position of the parts of the torso and how the torso is supporting the neck and head, despite the fact that, of course, he's leaning forward. Yeah. And there is a geometry in this. There is one thing that we see here, and we can compare what's on the left, the images of wrong use, and the image of right use. But the main difference is expressed very simply by saying that on the left, these gentlemen are, well, standing, for example. One is standing, the other one is lifting their hands to reach for something that is higher. I don't know if he's trying to put the head on some individual, or if he's, I don't know, reaching for a box that is on a high shelf. I don't know. But what we see is that while doing these movements, the person is shortening the torso. There is a clear contraction of the mechanism of the torso, while Alexander, don't imagine that it's easier to work with a small person. You will see that Alexander is placing his hands while on the lower torso of that young girl, so it's he has to reach downward, and as a result he's bending. But while bending the legs in a strange way, I admit, is seen to expand the mechanism of the torso in such a way that we see that the abdomen is not protruding. We see that the back is lengthening. Why do we know it's lengthening? It's lengthening because geometrically, it's as if the lumbar region and the lower thoracic region was exactly aligned. And we also see that the head is projected very far forward and up, so that the ear is just forward of the line of the front of the torso. Instead of having the abdomen in front of the ear, we see that the ear is in front of the abdomen. So he's lengthening and widening the back and directing the head to go forward and up relatively to the middle torso, relatively to the lower rib cage. These are facts. This is what we see. Yeah. So in practice, right side, if you want to teach an individual to stop the habit of movement of pulling the head back and down, Let's see, you notice that the pupil has a tendency to pull the head back and down, to tighten the neck. Well, for Alexander, it is useless to tell that individual to stop doing his habitual movements of the head and neck, or to think of releasing the muscle of the neck, which are apparently involved in the act. It's also useless to use your hands to place the neck repeatedly, to place the neck and head of that subject in the correct alignment or in the correct relativity. And why is that? Well, because it does not give that subject any knowledge of the combined movement of all the other parts of the mechanism, in particular the mechanism of the torso, which are conditioning the use of the head and neck. It's absolutely useless to think about freeing the neck. That doesn't occur in the mind of an initial Alexander technique teacher, because the freeing of the neck is a consequence of a new combined use of all the different parts of the torso and limbs all together. Let me try and say this slowly, because I know that for many Alexander teachers, modern Alexander teachers that are listening, this can be, well, shocking or difficult to hear. The movements that resulting in the pulling of the head back and down, and the position of the head to the neck and upper torso that result from the movement of all the parts are an expression of the incorrect direction of the general use. The decisions that this individual is making, decisions regarding the movement of the lower leg, decisions regarding the decision of course, the thigh, the upper leg, the decision regarding the orientation of the pelvis, the decisions regarding the orientation of the rib cage, the directions also of the movement of the arms. These are the conditions that make for the wrong use of the head and neck. Trying to change the wrong use of the head and neck goes against the primary principle. That is that general use affect any specific use. So, in other words, I want to take expression that I used in the last session. These specific movements or defects, if you want to call them, are the consequence of all the inharmonic actions or inharmonic movements of the parts of the anatomical structure that the subject is seen performing when responding to the simple order, for example, to stand upright, to reach up with the hands, or to reach down to touch something that is lower. Pulling the head back, protruding the abdomen, wearing the upper part of the arm behind the lower rib cage, pulling the upper rib cage back and down, yes, are all defects in the general use of the self, and they can only be changed through a change in the combined movements which make the general use of the self. The primary control of the use of the self is the organization of all the movements of the parts of the self, and not the organization of the movement of the head relatively to the neck. So we are back to this concept of use. And so there are controversies. There are some modern Alexander technique teachers that are saying that the use is some sort of a word without content, that in Alexander's books, use is not defined properly. Well. The first thing you have to realize is that when Alexander employs the word use, the verb use. So, for example, there is a sentence, he said, when I used my voice. the term using in the verb using or the verb is not employed in a metaphorical sense. It really meant that he was doing a process with a complex mechanism to a certain end. This is the absolute definition of the word using. Yes? Most people who use their voice or use their neck or back or legs have no idea of the combined movements which they involve in this use. And they have even less knowledge of the general use of the self involved in the dynamic carriage of the whole structure. We are back to these words carriage and demeanor. You know, how do you support the voice? Well, there are different ways to support the upper part of the structure. You will see very different action. That Alexander is capable of, for example, first imagining. You have to imagine directions of movement that will help you direct the movement of all the parts relatively to one another. That is the first problem. Well, the second problem is, in fact, are you seen on video, are you seen on a picture, obtaining in practice, these movements that obey the instruction you've given? So here, I want to look at a statement that is coming from a first-generation teacher, one of the most intelligent teacher of the first-generation teacher, according to me, and this is George Trevelyan. George Trevelyan had difficulty with the Alexander technique to the point that he even never taught it. But that doesn't matter. He was really, really intelligent. He could not understand really what it was about, how to teach it, so he decided not to teach the Alexander technique as it is taught nowadays in the modern Alexander technique system. But what he says is really interesting. He says, Alexander, shows that although there are no right positions as such, there is a right relationship of parts to each other. A right use, which, while maintaining the most advantageous conditions throughout the body, still allows for movement and adjustment. And I want you to think about it. Okay, no right position as such, but there is a right relationship of the position of the parts. You will find that here is doing a shortcuts. He said the right relationship of parts. There is no right relationship of parts. You can have a right relationship for the positions of the parts. Yes. So I submit the idea that Alexander is expanding the torso as a result of combined movements that are directed by verbal instructions, combined instructions of movement that help the person make decisions. The important part in the technique is making decisions and thinking, okay, I want a right relationship of the position of the parts, and that will bring advantageous condition. Well, remember something, Alexander is, interested at first to helping his problem of functioning of the vocal system. So when we are discussing advantageous conditions, we can say that the right use of the different parts of the position of the different parts of the torso is going to help vocalization. And I'm making a bit far-fetched. Because the vocal system, apart from the lungs, of course, is not inside the torso. So we need to take things slowly and see how we can, somehow understand what is Alexander's perspective on this. Otherwise, we are going to think that vocalization is some specific activity that is specifically directed toward, I don't know, the clergy, the person, or not the clergy anymore, but for example, there were many lawyers that were working with Alexander because they had this necessity in their, business life to speak in front of a public. Or, of course, actors and comedians have this same necessity. And anybody will find a position in a social position when they can speak in front of a group. So that's vocalization. Some teachers nowadays of the modern Alexander technique have this idea that before the Alexander technique, there were these vocal teachers, the elocutionist. And the elocutionist has nothing to do with the Alexander technique. The Alexander technique is something that has to do with placing hands on people. Here, we are faced by this idea of right relationship between the decision of combined movements of the different parts to each other. And that is clearly what Delsart would call a moral decision. That may be a surprise to many people. What has moral to do with the Alexander technique? Well, we have to think what is motivating what we decide to do and not to do with the movements of the different parts of ourselves, and what will be the first answer is to, answer that it's the conception regarding the task we perform. If you consider that vocalization exercise is something for, I don't know, the neck and head and the lips and the mouth and the tongue and the larynx and the lungs, of course, you are not following the principle of the initial Alexander technique. You are, in fact, separating vocalization from demeanor. You're separating vocalization from support from the floor upwards. What is supporting the vocal mechanism? Yeah. Many teachers of the modern Alexander technique are making fun of my work, or fun of the initial, the early Alexander technique. Vocal culture and elocution lesson is considered to have nothing to do with the modern Alexander technique. I do profoundly differ with that. I think that the everyday view, the uninformed view, or regarding the use of the voice, misses the fact that the process of speech production is both a mental act, in the sense of course, gathering what one wants to say and not to say in the form of related idea, but it's also a physical act, because it's supposed that the speaker, according to Alexander, is required to coordinate different movements of the lips, tongue, vocal, respiratory mechanism in order to emit and control the sound that correspond with the production of intelligible speech. But secondly, and more importantly, according to Alexander, speech production requires to coordinate different movements of the parts of the anatomical structure to as he said, imitate with truth the gestures with completed the expression of the part to be played in front of the public. That is, expression is not just how you sound. I know I sound horrible. I've heard that many times, and I accept it as true. English is not my first language, so I must sound awful. That's a fact. Yeah, but it's not only that. It's also the expression. Where do you push your argument? Where do you suspend the argument for people to consider? So, makes sense to employ the expression, the use of the voice, because in speech speech expression, we are able to obtain a result from a complex process of which we have no direct control. We don't know how we move the lips. We have no idea how we move the tongue. What are you doing with your larynx when you're speaking is well, part of the process, but we are not directly, in fact, controlling these different parts of the process. What Alexander is saying, though, he says that these different movements are, in fact, indirectly subordinated to the general use of the self. How you organize the movements of the different parts of the torso in speaking is going to be an indirect control of the placement of the tongue, the placement of the soft palate, of course, the tension in the soft palate bed that comes from having a particular smile that is using particular muscle of the face. And if you want to start training these act as conscious parts of your expression, he says, first, you need to organize the general use of the self. You have to organize carriage. How do you carry yourself? What it is you're doing with the different parts to carry yourself when you're speaking. That's it. You see, for a Delsart student, as well for a person studying the initial Alexander technique, the combined movements of all the parts of the self, and in particular, the combined movements of the different parts of the torso, well, these are involved in the act of vocal expression. They cannot be separated. So you cannot really, consider a low teaching like vocal expression and a high teaching, the Alexander technique. No. Well, it's very difficult to draw a limit. Obviously, the movements of the different parts of the torso are not simply or only involved in the vocal expression. Well, they are conditioning the functioning of many, many other actions. And from this principle, we can make a reasoning. We can say, well, then, if that is the case, the eradication of any defects or incorrect movements in the act of expression, being an act of the feet, ankle, you could see how you organize the pelvis, how you organize the rib cage, and if you do it incorrectly, and if you want to eradicate any of these defects or help somebody eradicate incorrect movements involved in the act of expression, well, that calls for a change in the general use of the self. So in the initial Alexander technique, we have now a clear idea that specific use is subordinated to general use. So let's take the case of of course, the organs of speech. Alexander started with the organ of speech. Yeah. At first, when you think about vocalization speech, you have to weigh things out. So that you have the fact that voluntary speech and verbal expression is learned and is developed to varying levels. We know that very, very young people, children, do not speak. They learn how to speak. And they learn how to speak with particular sounds. We know that depending on the country where you're born and your mother tongue, you're going to learn this verbal expression and no other. And with the graduation in speech that pertain to different cultural public. But that despite all that it's learned, most people at first will tend to think that speech is a natural human inheritance. And the result that practice tends to make perfect. If you speak all day, you're going to, well, certainly speak better. Well, we questioned this certainly. Alexander was really working on his speech, as many other actors, and he found that practice, in his case, did not tend to make perfect. On the contrary, overuse or a lot of practice, a lot of using the voice, shouting all day, tended to create a functioning problem. So, despite this, and in all probability, we can imagine or assume that FM Alexander started dealing with his problem of his throat problem from this perspective. And that is even more interesting because his physical speech problem occurred consequently to vocal overuse. He was, despite, led to discover that beyond the mental and physical dimension of doing speech, as I said before, there was a moral problem involved, a problem of will, a problem of decisions. His decisions of the different parts of the mechanism as a whole when using his voice, that is, when supporting the vocal mechanism, these decisions of actions were not based on correct premises. That was a reasoning on his part. And why could he say that? Because his decisions of movement regarding the combined movement of all the parts led to further impairing his bearing and demeanor, and that way indirectly further impairing his voice production. So his manner of using the whole torso, that is the combination of the movements of the different parts of the torso, the lower, the middle, the upper torso. This is the segmentation that was introduced by Delsart. You can have 3 different parts. You have the upper rib cage, the lower rib cage. So in this case, for example, you see that this gentleman is, of course, pulling the upper torso, upper rib cage backward and projecting the lower rib cage forward. In the opposite, if you look at the pubic bone, you will find that the pubic bone at the front of the pelvis is thrown forward and down, and the back, the lower sacrum, is thrown upward. So you start looking at different kinds of rotations that this gentleman, with more or less consciousness or clear intentions, is rotating in different ways. These different rotations leading to shortening the back. The shortening of the back is not some sort of bad habit that you cannot separate. No, Delsart showed that it's possible to separate the movements. It's not easy. It's not easy to learn how to separate movements, but well, it is not that difficult when you have a teacher guiding you in these experiments and giving you tools, what we call means whereby instructions that are describing the movements so that your decision can be based on reasoning instead of basing the decisions on feeling. So in the case of Alexander, his manner of using the whole torso, we mean by that the combination of movement of the different parts of the torso that he was seen to accept, he was seen to produce. We would say he was doing these movements of the part. The gentleman on the left, it's very interesting because it's a sergeant. It's from the military. And this is not a relativity of position between the part that he invented. Not at all. This is a social construct. This man is clearly creating this posture, as it was thought that it was a good use, a good presenting a good organization of the movements of the parts. I differ, but I must accept the idea that this man knows what he's doing. with the different movements of the parts. Yeah, that was different for Alexander because Alexander didn't know what he was doing with the movements of the parts when he started to use speech as a mode of expression. But in this case, we see that, well, it looks possible. Well, the general effect is a bit dire, but it's possible to create that relativity of the positions of the parts. If you accept that you can learn to do this, you could imagine that it's possible to, of course, accept a reverse process where you learn to combine the movements in such a way as to lengthen the torso and direct the head forward and up relatively to the lower rib cage, yes, instead of having the lower rib cage forward and down relatively to the head. This is the proposition of the initial Alexander technique. How can we combine several decisions of movements at the same time all together? It's just an experiment. We are starting to ask questions, yeah, at a functional level. Is it possible to change the movement? And will these movements, well, be combined in a different way? All these questions are exactly the kind of study we want the pupil to engage in. Very many people say, oh, you're a teacher, when they ask me about my job. I do not consider myself as a teacher, really. I consider myself as someone that is studying, has been studying the subject of conscious guidance and control for quite some time. And as a result, it's possible for me to help others, if they want to, study what is the conscious guidance of the different movements of the part of the anatomical structure in order to get this result that we call back to lengthen and widen, neck free, head forward and up. These are all results for me. And it's necessary to study how we can consciously, in fact, project intentions and obey these instructions in practice. That's the point. We have still to discuss why it is that well, a different organization of the part is going to really create a support for the vocal mechanism. How is it that practicing this study, creating new experiments, new instruction, observing how these instructions are translated in practice, we have to ask ourselves, well, is that possible? How can we improve our capacity to direct the movement of the parts? And the last question is this one. You can see we next to the Sergeant Major, I have placed, well, the sort of retraction of the head and neck and the positioning of the head relatively to the rib cage. And well, it's what I call the functional level. The strange, well, purple mesh you see at the front is a technical representation of the tongue. The tongue is a very complex organ, and it's, of course, at first, the function of the tongue is not to produce speech. At first, the function of the tongue is to help to, in fact, chew and swallow food or liquid. It's necessary to make sure that when you swallow, when you perform the function of swallowing, it's absolutely necessary to have to make sure that the tongue is really, well, projected forward and upward into the mouth, so that the larynx is pulled upward in order to close the airways. Swallowing is a process where you have necessity to, of course, close the airways. There should be ever no food, no liquid that goes inside the windpipe. It's a death situation. or slow or fast, depending. Slow in the case of there is something that is coming into your lungs and that will fester, and there is no protection in the lungs, so you're going to die from septicemia. Or it can be also slow because you're going to progressively have difficulty eating, because every time you eat, you know there is a risk of choking. And the people that have got that, we know this for people with old age or dementia, have more and more problems of directions of movements. And in particular, it will lead to having problems of swallowing. And these people will not eat. They will prefer not to eat, but to have food going into the airways. And also the tongue is involved in, as we know, in voice production. And in voice production, we will find, well, the voice production starts with having air into the lungs. It starts with breathing. Breathing and voice production are really related to each other. And we will find that, of course, the tongue and airways are suspended. They are suspended to the jaw and to the skull. And so, therefore, the position of the support of the tongue depends on the relative position of the rib cage, because, of course, the tongue and the larynx, the base of the tongue is attached to a bone we call hyoid bone. It's marked in orange here. This bone, hyoid bone, is just the top of the pharynx. So it's top of the larynx. And so when you swallow, the top of the larynx has to come very, very close to the mouth, so that there is no distance between the back of the mouth and behind these airways. There is what I call the food tube. Yeah, there is a tube that is just behind. So most of the time, the tongue should be lengthened. Yeah. And the larynx should be very far back and down, so as to maintain the esophagus, that food tube, closed. You have to understand something. We don't want any food inside the airways, but also we don't want any air inside the esophagus. When you breathe, when you speak, the esophagus is closed. This is done by the relative position of the head to the jaw and the head and jaw to the torso. If you are pulling the head back, projecting the lower rib cage forward, as you see, you are at a risk of showing a swallowing position for the tongue at the moment you are supposed to breathe or to speak. Well, that means that you have a tendency to close the airways. It's going to be completely difficult to breathe. So you're going to have a tendency to gasp, to accelerate the air, and to dry, your pharynx, which is not pleasant. But also, due to the swallowing position that you have imposed because of your bearing, you will have a tendency to have the esophagus just slightly open. It's sufficient. If you have the esophagus slightly open, two things can happen or will happen, is that first you will eat air at the moment of taking the air in. If the esophagus is not properly closed, you'll have a tendency to ingurgitate air. It's not pleasant. And what is even less pleasant is that just after the tube of the esophagus falls directly down into the stomach. The stomach is a curious piece of engineering. It's a chemical plant, and this chemical plant works with acids. Acid in the throat is also very, very unpleasant. And it's a disturbance, a specific problem of functioning, that when you have a sore throat, it can be either or that you are accelerating the air by sucking or gasping, but it can also be you can have no gasping sound that is easy to hear in your speech. In between two sentences, you will not hear the person do something like this, but still the person will complain of, gastric reflux, of inflammation. And so it's necessary to understand that Alexander was quite right in his idea of general use, being influencing the specific use of the parts. And it's absolutely impossible to imagine that by directing the head and neck of that person, you could gain anything in terms of functioning. But the whole point, when we discuss the relative positions of the parts and the elasticity, how this affects the length and elasticity of the muscular support of the airways, well, I do not study this aspect. I do not focus on some sort of health effect of the Alexander technique. I'm not interested. I'm more interested in experiments, in seeing whether a person can make decisions of movements. I mean, related decisions that are sought out in advance, and how to direct these movements altogether, and how to control whether these movements are effectively happening in practice, in actual practice, or not. That's a different question. A different perspective on the Alexander technique? Will it improve? Poof. I don't know. It's just interesting at first to become capable of weighing our capacity of decisions, weighing our capacity to combine in advance, weighing our capacity to transform decisions into actions. In life, what is important really is actions. And the modern Alexander technique has completely lost this thing, because the actions, the decisions are made by the teacher. Here in the initial Alexander technique, it's absolutely clear that the teacher is going to, discuss decisions with you. He will discuss the decision you're making. Why is it that you're seen standing or bending in the way you do? So, for example, I want to finish with this, the frog dance experiment. We have Alexander that is describing a procedure. So he said, you're sitting, and you let showing the picture of just 2 sentences coming from man's supreme inheritance. That's a very interesting moment when he's talking about coming upright from sitting. So he's discussing what decision you want to make to come upright. That's it. Let the whole body come forward until the center of gravity falls over the feet. That is to say, until the poise is such that if the chair were removed at this point, you would be left balanced in the position of a person performing the frog dance. Then, by the exercise of the muscles of the legs and back, straighten the legs at the hips, knees, and ankle until the erect position is perfectly attained. If you care to experiment on a frame in this act of rising, you will observe that in the movement as performed by an imperfectly coordinated person, the same bad movements occur, tending to stiffen the neck, to arch the spine unduly, to shorten the body, and to protrude the abdominal wall. So on this example, it's absolutely clear that the person is going to, in fact, perform some movements. There are movements of the different parts of the legs and the torso. When we say straightening or straightening the legs at the hips, knees, and ankle, you must understand that straightening the legs at the hips means moving the lower torso relatively to the legs. That is what is meant. So I want to show you I cared to experiment. And I wanted to experiment. So I didn't experiment with a frame. I experimented with a teacher of the modern Alexander technique that wanted to have sessions and lessons with me. So at first, the person is not sitting because I don't want to make things too difficult. The person is just bending. So the person is in the frog dance. The person is not falling forward, not falling backward. We can estimate that of course, the weight and the center of gravity is above the feet. And so I ask the person to straighten up. Yeah. And so there are different spots that are indicated. I have the top of the sternum spot. I have the lower part of the sternum spot. The sternum is the bone that is, in fact, constituting the front of the upper rib cage. And also I've got a spot that I call the back of the internal part of the arm. I discussed these experiments with the student, of course. And so we see that the student is starting to, as Alexander was explaining, is straightening at the hips, is straightening at the knees, and it's straightening at the ankle. Okay, then we continue and you see the same person, same movement, the person continues, but in this picture, there is a difference now because the person is seen straightening, well, at the hips only. I don't see, or the movement of straightening at the ankle is still a little bit possible to observe. Well, yeah, but the knee is not straightening anymore. We know that the knee straightens when the knee is moving in relativity with the foot so that we see the knee moving back. So you will find that from the first expression, the knees, can you see the knees moving back? I hope so. We'll show it again. The knees are moving back, extending. And third, knees are not moving that much. And we continue, oh dear. That person has stopped the movement of the knees. Alexander considers that there is a decision to stop the knees. I know by asking the person that the person had no idea he was stopping the movement. But we see on video that he does. So I will convince him that it's possible to order the movement of the knees. I'm not asking the person to order the knees. You can't order the knees, you know, it's like, it sounds like a stupidity in language, but in fact, it is very important to use correct instructions. So I'm not speaking about the relativity of the position of the parts or the position of the parts. I'm talking about the relativity of the movements, because here it's absolutely clear that to start with, the person follows what Alexander is saying. Between the first and second, we see a movement at the hips, knees, and ankle. But then, the movement at the knees nearly stopped. And then look at what's happening with the mechanism of the torso. When the person is starting to straighten, the straightening at the back is rather curious. The person is straightening from the upper back, and we can see that the middle back movement is really small. The middle of the torso here is not going back. From that moment on, we can see that the person is protruding the lower rib cage. We can obviously see that this was a little bit in evidence here, but now we can see that the person is moving the top of the sternum bone much faster backward than the lower rib cage. And look at the position of the arm. The arms were more or less in front of the upper rib cage in bending. As soon as the person tries to extend, the person is extending, accelerating the back of the arm backward. We can discuss this, yes. And when the person continues to stand, we find that, well, the person is performing a series of combined movements where, of course, the pubic bone and the lower rib cage are pushed, protruding forward, the upper torso is pulled back, and the arm is really set backward relatively to the middle rib cage. So we can say that this person, this teacher, is standing, well, according to what he feels, okay? So it's quite interesting to see what is the habitual relativity of the parts. and what the person after just one session is capable of combining some movements. So instead of having the back of the internal part of the arm directed backward all the time, we start to direct the back of the internal part of the arm forward. And of course, that is a quite interesting thing, is that it's suddenly possible to imagine directing movements, but it's also possible to imagine directing an inhibition of movement. We can start to say, I don't want to go back with the back of the internal part of the arm. And in this picture, when I go back with the lower torso front, would it be possible to go back with the lower torso front without going back, refusing a movement? So directing a positive movement is a direction of performance, definite performance, and refusing to have a part moving backward when another one is moving back, the relativity can change, because you can say, I want the front of the pubic bone to go back when I straighten up the hips, but I don't want, of course, the lower sacrum to move backward. I refuse. Yes, I imagine that I will combine a movement back with a refusal of going back. I understand this looks very complex, but in fact, when the person is involved in this action, the person will find that the end result of straightening up is a function of the decision of movement you make. So we start to understand that, wow, lengthening the back, there is a difference between the two pictures, is that it's obvious that the picture on the right is not absolutely perfect, that the person is still pulling the head and neck back because there is not enough opposition of movement between the upper torso and the middle torso. The middle torso is still arched slightly, but, well, you can see that picture on the left, the abdomen is forward of the head. Pictures on the right, well, the head has slightly moved forward relatively to the lower rib cage that has moved back. It's not at all perfect, but, well, something is starting to show. And the direction and the support has changed. That is, the legs are much straighter, and the upper torso and the neck are much more supported, as they are not on this, because here we can see that the person is arching the back, and the whole structure is in fact combating the fact that he's falling forward. On this picture, it's much more upright. So the conditions of the use of the voice are much better in image B, the one with reason relativity of the movements of the part, as they are not in the image on the left, habitual relativity between the movements of the parts. So this is the first overview of how we start constructing the concept of use, that is general use of the self, to which specific use are subordinated. But I think I will expand on this in another session, because it's important to understand also that a concept, to have a practical validity. I mean, a concept is something you want to use in practice. It's something you need in order to solve problem. A concept is not just a word or the meaning of a word. Yeah, use. What is the meaning of use? Well, it will depend from individual to individual. The more you understand the general use of the self as combined action, and the more you can define which action you want to see, which action you don't want to see combined in order to obtain a general relativity between the parts, the more your concept of general use is going to become operative. That is, in sitting, in standing, in walking, you're going to start to have guidelines that are helping you making decisions. Initial Alexander technique is about making decisions in practice. Any question or comment?
Yeah, no, that's excellent on use. So concepts, then, a concept is a tool rather than like piece of knowledge floating abstractly. So the point of having the concept of use is to use the concept to make things happen in practical reality. And Alexander's talking about converting ideas into practical procedures, and he's using the word use in order to do that. It's not just describing things for the sake of a book. It's this is a word that he's come up with or is using based on practical experiments and work that he's doing.
Yeah, my answer would be he's not come up with that word. He has constructed the meaning. The meaning is a construction, and when people say there is no or very few description of what is the meaning of use in Alexander's book, this is very, very surprising. The whole Universal Consent in Living, the fourth book, is dedicated to precising what he means by general use and the relationship between general use and specific use. And so it's impossible to say that the concept of use is poorly described in Alexander's books. This is absolutely incorrect. To finish, well, it's Vygotsky that is describing concept or what he calls scientific concept. He makes a difference between everyday concept, the meaning of a word that you have when you discuss at a cafe or a coffee. You have a nice conversation with people that you're not solving problems, you're discussing. Okay, there is another representation, which is what Vygotsky calls scientific concept. I would say technical concept. There is a massive difference between the everyday concept and the technical concept, is that the technical concept is a real act of thinking that incorporate attentions on different things, that incorporate memory, that incorporate, of course, the will to make a decision, the will to combine. And this act of thinking has only one object or only one existence. It exists to solve problems that you encounter because you discover that you have habits of movements that do not disappear because somebody has placed you in a different position, different relativity between the part that, or even you have had a session with the initial Alexander technique and you discover that despite you have discovered that in a very short period of time, like 2 seconds, you can create an adjustment of movements that is going to expand the torso. Well, you find that if you don't observe yourself, you will imagine that this is still the case. Well, if you're film, you will imagine that if you direct your attention elsewhere, suddenly you're back to the old use, the old combined movements, and you think, wow, wow, wow. It's not a sort of a final solution. You take the Alexander pill and you are fine. You're great. You have had 1 lesson or 30 lessons of 1 hour. And how come I am not great now? Yeah. Welcome. Discover what we call habits of combined movements or habits of general use. Habits of general use are deeply, deeply ingrained. It's not something that you solve in. I have some guys complaining that after 30 lessons, or I don't think 37 lessons, he found himself still performing the same subconscious movement all the time. Obviously, yeah, it's part of the game. Yeah, you discover that despite the fact that you know much more, that you know much more about yourself, about your capacity of making decisions, which is not a pleasant subject. It's a subject of discipline. It's a subject of really being very clear about which movement you want to instruct, which movement you don't want to see perform, which movement you want to see inhibited, and performing again in front of the camera time and time again. So it's difficult to compare a guy that has 37 lessons with another that has 330. It's not the same amount of hours. Why would somebody take 330 sessions? You know, it sounds, well, no, Well, if you look at producing music, producing any sort of complex performance, like a surgeon that has life and death in his movements, well, you will see 37 hours is nothing. Oh, you discover a few things. You just scratch the surface, and you just find your own difficulty in organizing your instructions, in organizing your memory and your attention, and in making decisions. It's not that easy. First of all, it's not pleasant, because you thought that you had found the Superman pill. What's going to transform me into a fantastic use of the self? Very funny. Yeah, but childish, really. Yeah. So concepts are technical concepts, sorry. We have to be precise, or scientific concepts if you want. There's the concept that you elaborate through experiments. That is what is called, there is nothing scientific. You don't wear a light blues because you're you're using scientific concepts. No, you just starting to organize your instructions and your orders in a way that is reasoned out of experiments that have been filmed, and you can see whether the movement of the lower rib cage is stopping too early or not stopping too early, or if it needs to be accelerated. Now, we will see next time. It's a famous teacher of the Alexander technique, called Frank Pierre Jones, and he's described, he had lessons with Alexander brother, A.R. Alexander, and then one day he had lesson with FM, and he described his lesson with FM. Very interesting. And he said, well, it was magic. It was fantastic. I was simply transformed, Suddenly, the trajectory of the movements were completely different. Suddenly, the timing were completely different, such that I could not recognize myself in sitting and standing. From that, I only kept of what he said what was really interesting to me. He said that what is important is the trajectory of the movement. It sounds geometrical to me. There is a starting point, an end point, and he talks about timing of the movements. I understand that if you manipulate someone, the person will have a completely eerie experience, will not be able to understand which movements you are modifying, which movement you're stopping, which movement you're accelerating, what is the timing of the different movements that Alexander could do with his hands. But this was not a lesson to me. There was no construction of the concept of use. There was nothing the gentleman Jones could use in order to change his decision regarding this business of straightening up. So, well, hands-on lessons do not construct a concept of general use that is technical. The initial Alexander technique has a completely different idea. The pupil has to experiment with the movements himself, watch the video where the teacher is describing the movement for him, because sometimes we don't see what's in front of our eyes. It's necessary to have somebody that is trained to see these movements and help you see. Once you start seeing, you say, oh dear, I stopped extending the ankle very, very early. Why is that? Maybe there is a conception that the knee should be used bent. Maybe you have been taught by your teacher that it was nice to release the knees forward. What do you mean by releasing the knees forward? So you're not extending the hips, knees, and ankle to straighten up. You're really extending the hips and knees and not the ankle? These are questions that you have to place in a technical experiment in order to construct a technical concept of use. So okay. I think that's what Alexander had in mind.
Perfect. Okay, so for people watching this video, if you'd like to book a lesson with Jeando, you can find a link to his website and his Facebook. underneath this video, and we will see you in the next video. Thanks, Jeando.
Thank you, Kevin. Bye.